Hello everyone, we're gonna get started now. So while you're waiting, we had this little challenge on the screen here to see if you could tell which one is AI made and which one is human drawn. So before I show you the answer on the next slide, show of hands, who thinks it's the top one is AI? Sorry. All right, and who thinks it's the bottom one is AI?
A little less than
half, okay. Yeah. 60-40 maybe. So the interesting thing is that the majority is wrong then. The first image was from Transformers versus Terminator cover art that I found randomly.
It's not the whole image, to be fair.
Yeah, to be fair, I cropped it down to match the AI thing. So the AI tool that I used was the Microsoft Copilot one, and it only generates square images to make them the same. I cropped down the cover to just a square image. But this is also a tricky example because it's a robot, so it's not. It's easier for machines to draw, sort of.
The reflective surfaces, as you were saying.
Yeah, reflective surfaces are a bit easier, and like the like people's skin and stuff, it's easier to tell a worse drawing of a face. But anyway, the whole point is that it is a challenge to tell the difference. You might not know it when you see it. So we do, as an industry, need to consider a bunch of the information that we're going to be talking about today. So this is what we're going to cover. Quick intro, and then I've structured it as a series of questions that people might have about AI, and we're going to try to answer them all for you. And we'll still leave more room at the end for any further questions you guys have. But the goal of the presentation is to go over what is AI right now, how it's affecting the comic book industry, how it could in the future get worse as well, with all these different talking points here. So who we are, my name is Brendan Montgomery. I'm the editor-in-chief of Sequential Magazine, a magazine that interviews Canadian comic book creators. So we just try to bring a voice to new and up-and-coming creators. We've published 17 issues online. You can find it at sequentialmagazine.ca. I've moderated a few of these panels before, and I made my own comics when I was at Queen's University as well.
So I'm Max Douglas, or aka Salgood Sam.
Oh yeah, I think you got to talk a little more.
Am I here? I'm not hearing myself.
No.
Is it on now? Is it on now? We were working a minute ago.
Right in the middle.
Oh. Hello? Do I press it?
No, slide it.
Slide it. Ah, okay, there we go. Hello? Still doesn't sound like it's going.
I tried pointing it right.
It's come. There we go. All right. So I'm Max Douglas, aka Salgood Sam. You may have heard that already, but I'll just repeat. So I'm a 30-plus year veteran of the commercial arts in general. I've worked in a lot of fields, but I started out kind of focused on comics and worked at Marvel early on, and didn't end up liking that, so more went the indie route. But I've got a lot of experience bouncing around doing a lot of different kinds of freelance and staff work as an artist, graphic designer, as an art teacher, you name it. What else did I mention over there? I founded the Sequential Blog, which Sequential Magazine spun off of back in 2002. And again, the goal was to try to help raise visibility for Canadian artists in the larger North American market, because we kind of get swamped by the Americans. So I just wanted to make it a central kind of clearinghouse of information about what we're doing. And I've been into computers generally since I was introduced when people were first starting to make home kit-built PCs in the 70s. My father had friends who were into that, so my mother. So I would run into them at people's houses. I went to computer camp. I never had a great aptitude for coding, so I didn't dive deep in that direction, but they've always been on part of my life. I had my first home system in the early 90s and have been interested in AI generally, both from the sci-fi perspective, but also a practical real thing for the whole time. And I guess that gets us to here.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll start off with just a general intro for those who aren't too familiar with what AI generation is for art and comics. But mainly, the biggest point I do want to get across is that there is no true artificial intelligence yet. There's no Terminator. There's no machine that thinks for itself. It's just a buzzword that everyone's using to describe these advancements in their learning algorithms. So the computer doesn't think or actually know anything. It's all statistical approximations of art. So it's still code that we've made, and it's just a type of pattern recognition where once you tell it, here's 500 pictures of a cat, it'll sort of know what a cat looks like. So it associates the words we give it for images, and then associates that with the output and the shapes of them and stuff over time. But it's not like actually, it has no way of thinking. It's just like statistics of the data.
Yeah. It was started from machine vision, right? Like the making images as a spin-off.
Yeah, so the technology did start with like detecting things first, so like security camera type applications, or now they're trying to do driverless cars that way too. But then once they were researching that, then they found that they could generate images in a similar, different way. So actually that's kind of what I mentioned here a bit. But things like the earlier Google Translate and stuff is a similar thing on the text side, where if you understand what certain words are and associate them with other words, you can actually train like translations better than just straight one-to-one copies of words. When it's talking about a whole sentence, it can learn and improve on that. But again, it's not actually thinking for itself. It's just a machine pattern recognition type of scenario. So the point is that this AI stuff that we're all hearing about now is not suddenly new. It's been developing for a long time, and it went by previous names of just machine learning or computer vision originally. But now everyone's using the AI buzzword, and it caught on, and investors are into it and pouring money into it. But all of this generation is new, but we've had similar kind of AI learning before. So currently we can generate an image if you give it a piece of text and say what you want to generate. And it is good at giving you what you're asking for. And a lot of the text generation that it does is not based in any factual knowledge. It's even the text is still just what it knows statistically would be the next word in a sentence, based off what you're asking for.
It's like it doesn't know what it's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about images, they're usually square for some reason. That's just the way the algorithms have been set up. Eventually they are expanding that, but they have been really bad at details of hands and like the way that fabric folds and stuff like that. But it's still improving. So we have like the problem with a lot of the AIs is that they're sort of random, so that creating a cohesive comic story with like the same art throughout all the way with the same characters is difficult, but they are working on that, and it is coming along, and even videos are now starting to be early stages, not publicly available yet. But how does the fundamentals AI technology work? So they try to mimic it after the human brain. So the human brain is built up of a whole bunch of different neurons, and each of those connect to each other in a web and form your decision making. So they've done a similar thing where they have these layers and layers of nodes, and how you flow from one node to the other is just based off of statistics. So you take input data and your output to train it. So the input data could be the word that you want to associate with the image, and then the output layer would be the image, and then it traverses these node patterns to how do I say it? Yeah.
It's the part of the black box thing. Oh, my mic's gone off again.
Well, you gotta talk right into it.
No, it's going off. It's a faulty connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello? No. Bad connection at the bottom of the mic. I'm gonna just speak loud. It's kind of like it's kind of like why they call it a black box system, because the path through those nodes isn't something that we can easily go look at. There are probably ways to figure it out, like tagging pieces of data so that it has sort of like a little coded signature. This started here and went this way. It's sort of the way the internet itself works. But mostly that's just like extra stuff they haven't sorted out yet and don't feel they need to. But this network pattern that sort of emulates neural networks is why they call it a black box. And it's kind of important to mention, it's just an emulation. Like a key difference is each of our neurons has a whole bunch of internal complexity that we don't even understand yet, that isn't part of this. Like it isn't just a transfer point for data in a neuron, it does stuff. Whereas the neural network is more like this kind of pattern of mixing and matching data, and it does stuff, but it's kind of a collective. It's back, and now it's gone again. So it does stuff, but like it's really interesting, it's fascinating stuff. but it kind of goes to what you're saying at the beginning, that it's not the mystical, what they're thinking now, or the misconception of what AI means. That's a bit misleading. It's a process that is much simpler and much less complex than the human brain, or any brain. And go back to you.
Yeah, and another point is that these models take a lot of data to generate these paths, because they are somewhat arbitrary, that it takes a lot of data for them to work out a consistent output from the same input.
Massive server farms.
It uses, the number of nodes here is also a very simplification too. Like some of the general ones that you can use on your phone now, like ChatGPT or whatever, are like at the millions of nodes level. Because we want them to handle, it depends on how much data you want to feed into it. So if you want to give it any possible word, then you need a bigger model. But if you somehow made it more narrow, you could have a smaller model. But when we're talking about images specifically, this technique of Stable Diffusion is how we got some of the more recent advances in the image generation side. So the easiest way to think of it is if you consistently, you can make any image super noisy by just adding noise to it, but then if you do it in a predictable way, and then you can undo that by subtracting the noise from the starting noise. It is actually really hard to explain too, but
we were saying, getting ready for this, that this slide is like not a terrible way to try to do a real basic version without a whole computer science degree, but it's misleading because it kind of feels like you're just encoding or encrypting or compressing the image somehow. It's not really that. It's more like it's messing up the image under a probability model, and that it uses that noise pattern to generate new images under a probability model, which is also why you don't get, like you were saying earlier, we don't get the exact same cat at both ends the way this picture suggests. You get, like every time you try to generate something, if you've played with these, you'll notice it's a little different. And it's not ever, unless you really confine it and give it a training image, a seed image, you never get an exact copy of what it's trained on, the way you would have with that starting cat. You get an approximation of a cat based on all of the cats it's looked at in its database, because it kind of understands there's a pattern that people have called cat. And you've asked for a cat, so it's pulling all of the probability models that were tagged cat. And then it's adding noise at the bottom wall, suggesting that it's showing there. Each time it's adding more noise from the cat model, or the cat tags, and kind of refining. And then if you look at the various different platforms, they'll say like how many what do you call them? Generations or whatever they call it, like how many times you want it to go through that process.
Yeah, just steps. Yeah, we can say steps,
but there's an actual usual term I'm blanking on right now that they usually use for it, and it's like how many times you want to do this, and it will refine and get cleaner and sharper and more precise as an image to a certain degree. Although sometimes it goes off the rails and gets worse.
Yeah, this is only showing 3 steps, or basically 4 steps, but it could be like dozens or
hundreds if you're willing to pay for the server time. And the end result will be an approximation of the idea of a cat as represented by all that probability. It's never, this is like we were saying before.
It kind of morphs on the way in between.
Yeah, it's each time it's making a new image, but it's sort of mixing the past generation with the new noise. And then let's make a new one, and let's make a new one. This is also goes to why the server farms and all of their costs to run are so high, because every time it's doing that, the more generations you do, you end up gobbling up more CPU time.
So yeah, they have found a way to shorten the CPU load by encoding images in a different format, basically. So this is separate from the generation, but you can actually just shrink down images with a higher dimension. So it's you can take a 2D image, but if you move it into a 3D data set, then you can actually reduce the size of it, because a lot of natural images have patterns that are regular that you can encode it without losing any data. So then they'll do those noise steps within this encoded space as a second level of complexity. But
that is a bit like compression.
So yeah, so this is compression, but if you do these first steps on the compressed data, it's faster. But so if you they are working on ways to speed it up. So it could keep progressing, and they could keep improving this. Right now, it does take a decent amount of time to generate an image, but it's getting better. But as we said, this uses a lot of computational steps and a lot of CPU time on a server, or GPU time on a server. So just to give you a perspective, like a simple text ChatGPT query uses 10 times more energies than a Google search. And now Google is going to be incorporating these types of AI things into their search. So their greenhouse gas emissions have raised like 50% in the last year.
And their counter, they always of course mention that they're buying green energy. And that kind of works, but that means that there's less green energy for other things. So people are then left using the other sources. So until we actually totally green the grid, you're still creating a problem. You're just increasing the demand, and there's only so much green energy going around.
Yeah, whereas generating an image can take as much electricity as fully charging your smartphone. Yeah. Which, when you think about how much you can do on your phone in a whole day, a full charge, versus just making one image, it's a huge increase. So on top of the impacts on artists that we're going to talk about next, AI has a huge environmental problem that is really not good for the society, and that's also why people should be aware of that. That's not just some silly computer thing that doesn't cost anything. There will be a growing environmental impact. So in terms of the actual data to power these models, we said it takes millions of images to power these. Where do they all come from then? So I looked up for the actual public statements of these companies on where they get their images from. So this is all what they're saying publicly. Now, could they be doing stuff they're not telling us? Probably, but
usually.
But so for DALL-E, it was trained on pairs of images and their captions. Again, they're saying publicly available sources and sources that we licensed. So maybe they paid for some of them, but publicly available could be anything they found on the internet and didn't pay for. Artists have found their art in these models that they never gave permission for. So. But they have filtered out explicit content or whatever, sure. But
only after people complained.
Yeah, when you start generating certain Nazis and stuff, then they'll take it out. But so Midjourney said that their training data was from the internet. Yeah, they didn't even sugarcoat it. They just said that they're just taking everything off the internet that they can. He wasn't even lying about that one. So then Adobe has been trying to do something a little more ethical with their Firefly model, but they're taking their own stock images, which people uploaded before this even was a thing, and are using those. So it's their stuff that they have permission for, but they never got permission to do that with it.
The consent there is a bit of a stretch. You didn't knowingly contribute to the process. You were just part of the scoop.
Yeah, and they also say public domain content, but are they actually checking the copyright for every image they throw in there? There are things that are public domain that would be completely legal to use, but are they actually checking that? Who knows?
There's also with Adobe, it's interesting that a number of artists who have been not just not part of Firefly's or the Adobe stock, but have been vocal opponents to all of this and don't want to be part of it, have found work generated using their names on Firefly that looks like it's seen their work. It knows what it's looking at. So whether they did it themselves or some other person uploaded it and used it that way, it's getting in there. So they're not effectively screening that out as well.
So then what is the legality of using art to train the AI? There are litigations right now in the US based off of their copyright law, which, for everyone's knowledge, when you have a copyright to an image, it allows you to control how it's reproduced, distributed, displayed, or performed if it's a play or something, licensed, and to prepare derivative works based off of it as well. So there's a couple of gray areas here. The distribute, if they're scraping it off of the internet, you didn't authorize the distribution from them to do that, maybe. Also preparing derivative works, how is that interpreted with AI? Is that a violation of copyright if you're deriving new art from their art? So this is all being worked out. We don't have a concrete answer, obviously, but there's definitely a lot of concern here when you read that definition on how does AI fit into US copyright law.
One of the big tells is I think it was the Microsoft guy who recently was in the press because he said in a talk that they were just treating all of it as freeware. which is, I don't know, there's a term that's a little bit dated now, but at the beginning of the internet, freeware was software that was put up essentially under Creative Commons, but the Creative Commons didn't exist yet. That was just meant to be free for everyone to use. But he was saying, like, all of the internet, all the publicly accessible internet that's not behind a password, is, in his mind, is freeware, which is not how copyright works. So, but that was their attitude going into it, and he's their AI guru. So that kind of tells you where their head's at.
And there has been a lot of U.S. copyright history in terms of like movies and DVDs and stuff, that movies and music that could be used as precedent on who can even transfer the files. Like burning like DVDs, making a copy of it has been theoretically illegal, but people do it anyway, obviously. But when you like recorded someone's VHS tape into another VHS tape, that was technically a
FBI warns you.
Yeah. Don't make a copy of it.
And I love it when the people who are very, very hyper pro AI will bring up sampling and sort of ignore that there's actually a huge history of legal cases around that, and you can't just willy-nilly sample anymore. Like, even if you didn't sample, but you just come close to someone else's music, you still can get sued. So that's actually a great example for those people who are not happy with this, because that's been dealt with, and there are guidelines on that.
So so my guess is that the scraping of data off the internet might actually be the more what they actually might get them on in terms of legality, because the outputs are transformative, and they are you can't even copyright the outputs because an AI model generated it. So you can only have copyright if a human created something. So you can't just have an AI spit out every possible song ever and then copyright every song forever. Like, someone has to actually make it for it to be copyrighted. So they might not get them on the output side of things, but I feel like they might have a case on the input side. But we have we're at like 20 minutes, so we'll have to keep it moving. So then this was your section about labor.
So first of all, a lot of times people will say, well, it's just like humans learning. As an art teacher, I can tell you straight up bullshit. It is not the way humans learn. For one thing, we have a lot of messiness going on in here with all the cognition. It's not as simple, like that machine learning node network we're talking about, hyper simplified, but also makes it very straightforward. Just learn this pattern. What is cat? Cat, 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 cat. We have tons of experiential encounters with cats. Some people hate cats, some people love cats. That's gonna bias your interpretation of cat. You're then in an art class where you're learning on your own, you're studying cats, you're looking at real cats, you're looking at other people's drawings of cats. You have opinions about that. It's not just, here's a picture of cat, it's what do I think about a cat? How does a cat make me feel? That affects your experience in your drawing. When I was teaching art, a lot of what I taught was about the mindset you want to be in when you're learning versus when you're rendering, which are different. And the kind of information acquiring stage when you're learning has a lot to do with being mindful of that and being able to filter it and being able to look objectively. We're not, shall we say, automatic observers. To become a trained observer as an artist, you have to unlearn sort of the unconscious process of just seeing without thinking about it and very consciously see things. Because otherwise you're operating on a lot of assumptions and things to take for granted. And like the thing you see around you right now, if you have working vision, is a model. It's not just pictures straight from the eye into your head. It's a model built in your brain of the world based on data from your eyes. Your eyes don't see this good, actually. Even if you have bad vision, your eyes don't see this good. It builds a much more superior model in here based on guesses and assumptions and your experience, which is why perception and observation are very biased individual to individual. Machine learning has none of that. As individuals, when we learn, we have to overcome that or be aware of it and incorporate it into our learning process. We have to go through a very laborious process of building up acquired knowledge. If you're learning, you'll know people's very slow, and then you have these spikes, and then you plateau for a while, and then that. Totally different from AI, which is a steady curve up. And the real issue here for me, like, I'm skeptical whether the copyright law stuff will pan out. There might be some other twist to it where they're able to get them unscraping, but I feel like odds are the real issue here that's going to be something that we can fight back or push back on is around labor. Because what I just described to you is years of labor to train to be an artist. And as a freelance artist when I was starting out, that was one of the first lessons. It's like, well, how much do I charge for my art? I was like, well, think about all the time that you need to learn how to make your art. Then think about the time it takes to make the individual piece of art. Now consider all of the costs that went into that. This includes the roof over your head, your rent, your food, everything. The lessons you paid for, the materials you use for a given individual piece of art, and then each time they pull a piece of art off the internet to train, they're pulling that labor. All the labor you put into that work, they're incorporating and hijacking to train their machine how to emulate the end results of. And the machine doesn't understand anything that went into it, but they understand the end result, and they're pulling our effort that produced that end result. So it's a form of labor theft, the way you've probably heard of things like wage theft, where you're not paid for hours, or you're expected to do free hours as part of the job. That's a little more obvious. This is a bit more subtle, but it's definitely the same family of labor issue. And for the creative field, most of us have moved away. Over the last 50 years, unions and guilds have been downplayed as things you want to be part of as a freelance artist or a staff artist. And that's unfortunate, because that's what we need, because that gives us the block to push for change both at state and with corporations. And the labor, the way the machine takes stuff, so I say it sort of mirrors our process but gets rid of it. I'm just looking at the points here to make sure I'm not forgetting stuff. Right, so it's basically, what they're trying to do is replace all this involved process that goes into you as an individual artist to make your work and the individual pieces of work with a machine that they then convince employers is adequate to replace you, or replace some of you. Like what you're seeing, I went and collected anecdotes that if we have time, I'll go through and summarize a little bit of people who've already lost their work. Some of them are in the arts, some are periphery to that. But a lot of it's situations where someone has decided, well, we can do with half of the staff. We'll get rid of 300 of the people in this call center or that graphic design department and keep half or less and get them to do the same work, because the AI will make this job easier and faster. But it ends up being not so much the case. Often you end up people who have now overworked, because the AI takes a lot of work to fix. It is not actually up to the job very often. And in the end, who's profiting from that often isn't even your employer, it's the company that generated the platform. So the people who are generating the AI are the ones engaging primarily in labor theft. That becomes a big issue. You can turn it if you want. If you want to, that becomes a really big issue, because we're both seeing a cratering of arts and arts-related jobs, not just arts too. I'm hearing about it from people in coding, people in tech support or various customer service type jobs, all sorts of areas. That is basically the companies that's making these platforms convincing bean counters at companies that their tool will replace us. So they're scraping up that profit, the generation company, because they've convinced our bosses that they can do it for cheaper. So we're in a situation where even if you're just interested in comics, and that's your thing, that's why you're here, and often I would get asked, like, how do you make a living in comics? I'll say, right off, very small number of us do. It's a tough gig. Basically only a handful of companies pay enough to really make a living, and then the remaining few, if you manage to make money off the comics, it's probably not like your sole income, and it's really hard to sustain it over the long term. So the question is, how do you make a sustainable living in comics? Usually the answer is to make a sustainable living in the arts. You learn how to make comics, and then you take the skills that you developed, all that labor, and you're able to parlay it into graphic design or editing or illustration or a variety of other jobs. Right now, I work in animation prop design. And the reality is those are the jobs that are getting sucked up even more than comics are under threat. So your ability to sustain yourself as a working artist, who then might have hopes to make comics one day, is getting smaller because AI is currently sucking that up. It might go backwards, because I think we're going to get into this in the slides, but a lot of these companies are sort of building vaporware. Like, it can't really do what it's saying it does, or at least not reliably. And again, like, they're going to get people to try to fix it, and often that'll be lesser paying work. But maybe there's a lot of people who are speculating about whether it's just going to collapse because it's all a bit of a bubble and it's kind of built on lies. And then there's all the energy costs and all of the material costs that go into starting these startups. And if they can't start bringing in money fast enough, it'll crater. But then we had the same principle behind things like Uber and Airbnb. And they're still going, and they still made a mess of things. Try to get an apartment in the city now. So it could still be a problem, even if it's not capable of doing what they claim. We still might be left in a situation where the labor market is transformed and not for the better. So I feel like the real solution for many of us, if we're interested in any field in either sort of the entertainment media field that most of the folks here would be into, or anything else for that matter. Like, this really is like a labor-wide issue. It's not just the arts. Everyone interested in it. Like, if you've seen the Figure One, is it called Figure One, I think, is the robot. It's one of the newest ones. It's got OpenAI's chatbot in it for a brain to interact with people. Very naturalistic, kind of creepy. I don't see them needing that for a factory job, but it could totally be doing other jobs, like maybe it's a caregiver for a retirement home, and that's great. Grandma's got a robot, but it's not a person. The reality is, this is probably going to require a lot of solidarity amongst labor in general, and I'll return to things like guilds and unions, so we have large lobbying blocks to push companies. And like a good model for how that would work is what the WGA was effectively able to do in Hollywood, to not keep AI out, but to set clear terms. Also the WCA, the Canadian Writers Guild, set clear terms on if it's going to bring in, you can't use it to displace us, we still get our credits, we still get our pay, we can't be forced to just work with it, we have a choice. And you can't downgrade our status as writers. And I think that's probably the more likely solution, rather than us like just going after them on legal grounds and suing them in court. We also need to change the labor landscape to protect our interests as humans. So
so now we'll dive in a bit more comic specific too, now that we've covered AI in general and the labor issues. So the question is, can AI make a comic book? Not entirely on its own, not at all. Like you can't just say, make me a comic book about Batman doing this and this and this, and it'll just give you a full comic book. So comics are like books. There's several pages. They're all put together. There's the whole publishing aspect of it, and then the actual art. It can do panel by panel, and there are tools that can help you put them together, but it's still generating the art panel by panel. It's not giving you a whole page all at once.
Like, it doesn't, I had a thought about this that I forgot to mention when we were talking earlier. It doesn't like understand all of the formalism that goes into sequential art, all the structure. Even more so than it doesn't understand what it's writing when it's like, when you've probably heard about books on mushroom collecting that are like generative AI and are actually really dangerous, and other things like that. But that at least it can ape the appearance of by a page of text, but it doesn't even, there's so much structure in a comics page that's not obvious unless you've had a lot of training. And
if you've if you've ever tried to make your own, or you've gone to other panels by comic creators, you'll understand that the composition of a page is very important to how readable it is. So even if the AI can generate the images one at a time, and you can put them on a page, it's not going to look good. It's not going to flow right. And how you have to design each individual panel so they connect with the other ones visually. And you have to do things like leave room for lettering and stuff that the AI might not do. And
if you're looking for that, it's called page flow, by the way, if you want to Google it.
Page flow, like everybody knows that like you read a page left to right, but then in a comics you kind of go in a Z pattern, so you go like left to right and then down and then right again. So you want the art to flow in that way, and the AIs don't do that.
Like, here's a thought. There's a different flow for manga. So aside from the fact that they read the other way, they also have something called the T rule, which is the way you transfer between panels and which panel has hierarchy, like left to right, or if you've got a long one next to two. The rules are a little different in manga. So that's a detail that they would have to hard code into the AI for it to understand it. It's not obvious just looking at pages. You have to know the cultural context and the way people read and see and perceive the page. And that takes a whole level of understanding the machines don't have.
And in terms of the writing of a comic, it can generate you a script. Is it going to make any sense? Is it going to have good characters? Probably not. So even if you give it a story prompt and it generates you a whole script, that's not going to be that great. But even if you skip that step and you write your whole own script and you're just doing it for the art, it's still not going to get you to a real professional comic level yet.
And I don't know if we were going to get into this here, but one of the thoughts I've always had about this, I was actually initially a little bit excited about DALL-E and the first hints of generative AI, because I thought if they could give me an ethically trained bare bones machine that I could train on my own art, I have a whole slew of like generic pop stories that I really don't care to draw, but it would be fun to make, and if I could make them cheaply, they'd probably be viable economically. And if it was, I wouldn't pretend it's me drawing it, but if I could do little thumbnails and write the script, great. That's something I could do with a real quickie, and I'd just call it, here's a quickie, I'll sell it for like the $1.99 cheap comics. But that's not what they're doing. They're creating machines that effectively displace me as a skilled person, And it's very similar. It's when people call me a Luddite, and it's like, well, yes, because I have exactly the same argument as the Luddites did, which is they didn't hate the looms. They hated them being run by child labor and replacing experienced weavers. And they got into smashing looms as a form of protest, but mostly they were a labor bloc who was upset about human-oriented work being replaced by profit-oriented work. So.
Yeah, and then what people often underappreciate too is how much art goes into lettering comics. So, organizing your balloons in a great way, having the sound effects all be integrated really well.
Flow again.
Again, it's flow too, yeah. There's a lot of rules to good lettering that you can learn from like Blambot.
I wonder if they're scraping Blambot's posts.
Yeah, so again, AI can just put text on the page, but it's not going to like necessarily know the comics medium that deeply. And lettering is something that when you look at a comic page, you'll see it right away, like when it's bad. But when it's really good, you won't even like notice it. So it's a little underappreciated in that way, but the AI is not going to get you there. But there are tools right now that are trying. So people have been trying. There are websites I put there at the bottom that claim that you can make a comic with them. And what they do is, all of these you can just Google anyway. They're just the first ones that came up on Google too. But what they do is it's like a bit of an interface that they've made where like it'll generate one image at a time for each panel, and you can make a layout to start with and then fill the art in and stuff. And but is it going to be a good composition? Is it going to really connect together? Like some of that's still on you, and then the tool might help you generate the art on the pages. But again, some of them can claim that they can do consistent characters between panels, which if you do just purely random AI images, you're not going to have the same costume of your character all the way through. Or face, yeah. But they are saying that if you give them training images on a character, they're saying that they can keep it consistent. I haven't tested that or anything.
There was a whole case of someone trying to copyright in the States an AI-generated comic, and they'd used, what's her name? She played Mary Jane in the new Spider-Man films.
Zendaya?
Zendaya. They used Zendaya as the prompt for the main character all the way through, and that's how they were able to get someone who looked appropriate in each panel. But one of the things that came up, aside from the fact that they lost their copyright case because there was too much AI in it, not enough human, was also like if this did well, Zendaya would be interested in a cut because you didn't get her permission to use her likeness, and that is a trademark thing at this point. So these platforms you mentioned too, he was showing this to me earlier. These have pre-existed before AI. It was using clip art. You could go into the same kind of site and make clip art comics that had the same sort of templates with word balloons and little characters and things. And so now they've just plugged in AI generation to the same systems.
Yeah, so we're not saying that like you can't make a comic with AI yet. So right now you could. It's just
it'll be crappy.
Yeah, it's just not going to be well put together. Yeah, it'll be obvious that it's lower quality, but again, there is, an argument to be made, I guess, that if you're a new creator starting out and you just want to get ideas on a page and you want to use AI to just like visualize things as like a pre thing and then draw it yourself later, there's a chance for that. But if you do things like poorly in terms of like flow and stuff in your sample thing, then you're still going to draw it poorly. So you still need to learn the medium, but there is also an argument to be made that maybe it'll help people learn making comics a bit if it's like an intro thing. But
how much more slides we got?
Just we've only got 5 minutes left on the panel, so that does lead into this. We'll go over this a bit quicker too, I guess, but then we're pretty much done anyway.
I think we've also sort of addressed this.
We've sort of addressed this a little bit, yeah. So you gave your example where, if you could train it only on your data and you're not stealing other people's art, then maybe an AI tool could help you with your process. There's a lot of potential here that I've thought of, and so we don't want to say like AI is going to be 100% bad for comics. Like artists have already used digital tools for years now. They can help with their perspective. They can help with the actual drawing process, and that doesn't mean that it's bad comics or anything. So there is a chance that AI can be useful, but what we're saying right now is if they're just going to generate the whole image whole cloth, it's not a tool anymore. It's replacing your labor. So there is potential that it can help speed up things. So like coloring is one thing. Maybe it's going to displace colorists. So right now there are specific people that color comics, but if an AI gets good enough where you can draw your pencil lines and it'll color it in for you, there's a tricky argument there on, you're going to run a lot of colorists out of jobs, but it'll help the people that couldn't afford to hire them anyway, maybe. So there's always gray areas here, and we're going to see how it evolves, but there is definitely, we don't want to say that AI is going to be 100% bad for comics. There's definitely potential that it can be a useful tool, but we have to get over these labor issues. We have to get over the stolen art. We have to environmental issue. Maybe that'll get better over time. Maybe they'll make the models more energy efficient, smaller. It's in their profit interest to do that because the energy costs them money. So anything, if you want to predict how tech companies are going to be in the future, what's going to make them money is a good starting point. So if saving energy is going to save them money, then they'll probably do it as much as they can. But paying artists that they use the training data is going to cost them money. Are they going to do that? Probably not. So
yeah, one of the primary reasons you hear them say they had to scrape is that they needed so much data, and that's only a half truth. There is more public domain art in the world than there is currently licensed copyrighted art. Hundreds of years worth of work. The problem is most of it's not digitized. So it would have cost them money to sit there scanning it all and digitizing it all in order to have access to it for their training models. And that, along with licensing, is just a whole bunch of time and money they didn't want to spend. They wanted to race to the finish line and start earning profits. So they thought it was all freeware, let's just scrape the internet, and off to the races they go.
And if you're only training on 75-year-old art, it's not going to look modern aesthetically. So
I think that when they really mutate badly, it's kind of interesting sometimes. It's some of the most interesting stuff they do. So if they had just used public domain stuff and then also just played with more, let the culture that develops around that evolve, then maybe it would have come up with new innovations just by accident between the mix of more human interaction and not just like, here's a thing, but human generating a baseline for it to generate over. And then it generating stuff, and you're like, no, I gotta change this, have it more editable, and then have it based on ethically trained data sets. There's potential there for a really interesting tool that could empower both artists and non-artists to do interesting stuff with it. But that wasn't in their profit interests. They wanted to go fast. So.
So I'll leave the summary slide up, but let's see if anyone has any questions for topics we didn't cover that they want to maybe know about. We do only have a couple minutes, so we'll have to be quick. But
thoughts or questions?
Yeah, we'll start on the right, I guess. Yeah. Oh, you. Yeah.
Yeah, in the helmet.
Yeah.
When we say that, like, is AI gonna replace jobs? There's like, the thing with AI is it doesn't have intent, right? It doesn't know what it's doing at all. There's no thought behind it.
Yeah, I didn't get to it, but I wrote about that.
Yeah. So when people, like, there's a bunch of, like, companies think, oh yeah, we're gonna remove all our artists, just use AI. The AI does not have an artistic vision. It doesn't know.
But also, that's not the AI doing it, it's the company.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do have to always have somebody running the AI, but it's going to steal more. Like they're not always going to eliminate every job, but they're going to try to eliminate as many as they can. Yeah.
And the people who, like, they can't control what the AI is actually doing, so it's just like maybe one day, I don't believe it, but maybe one day it will be more efficient and more able to.
But it would have
controlled, but it's never going to fully just spit out an image that's like a perfect work of art with full consistency,
or it's too random is the ultimate thing. Like if you're in an animation studio or in your gaming studio or whatever, your boss doesn't want you to go, here's 50 images to choose from. Which one do you like? They might want 2 or 3, like when I do a prop, they depending on what the thing is, if I'm drawing a cab, I will do 2 or 3 cabs just to see which way the client wants to go. But that's it, and they want some specificity. And then they want me to revise the cab, not generate a new cab if they don't like it. And like, there's some great posts about this from people who were been heads of gaming departments where they were forced to take on people who were working with, or basically prompt artists, and they were unable to do revisions. They're just like, here's a thing, okay, here's another thing, here's another thing. And that doesn't work in a workflow environment. And then it's also very much, like you're saying, it's the AI hasn't got intent, and that includes taking the job. Like I kind of dislike the rhetoric of stealing jobs. The OpenAI is aiming to steal jobs. The AI they produce is just the thing, the tool that they've produced.
Yeah, so that is our time, unfortunately.
Is that it, our time?
We can take one last question.
Okay, well we've got 2, but
let's go with you.
Yeah.
Do you think that we should just limit who gets to use it? It could be a great tool for artists, but I think the problem is the fact that more non-artists are using it just to create things full out without going to help of artists. Like, do you think we should limit that?
I don't think there's a way to effectively do that in a relatively open society. So that's the problem. Like, it sounds reassuring, and if we lived in a world where a given field was controlled by a guild, you could probably get away with something like that. Like, you have to be a guild member to do this thing. But even that kind of enforced, that's kind of what turned people off guilds in the end. And I don't think it's the direction we should go with it. So, personally. Is that going to be it? Or can we get one more in?
Yeah, we had one more on the line.
He's going to be nice.
I'm just curious if your perspective also extends to LLMs, because they've been trained
Oh,
on
yeah.
everything in the English
Well,
language. So even if the AI is just looking for an answer to a question or looking for the help documentation for your prompt, it's still using every piece of literature that's ever been published on the internet.
Everything we just talked about, it was a bit picture biased, but it's the exact same thing for LLM. LLMs are part of it. And like, I don't know if we have, is there a name for the visual version of an LLM?
Well, Stable Diffusion is the like method that they came up with.
Yeah,
but
so it's kind of like, but that's not an LLM exactly.
no.
We
Yeah,
have-
the
we have
large
a
language models.
large image model,
Yeah.
basically. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're using it as like a search tool, that's a different thing than like replacing a writer, making a whole book.
what ChatGPT will do is people are doing that with Chat
You can do,
and others.
yeah, they got language models doing both, but anyway, but yeah, we'll
not reliable.
let you guys enjoy the rest of the convention. Thanks for coming. It's a great turnout.
I